My name is Nicolas Servino, and you're listening to the University of Chicago Public Policy Podcast.
Hey listeners, this is Lauren Lee, a production manager for UC3P. If you've been listening to this podcast over the past few months, you'll know that we've been growing, and quickly. We have multiple new podcast series for you to check out, including Chicagoland and Thank You for Your Service. That said, as we grow, we still need more time for development. That's why we're really excited today to bring you a blast from the past. 2 years ago, we tried to start a show called What If? It was a big production that took one topic and comprehensively explored it. Our current publisher, David Raban, hosted and produced the show. Unfortunately, it proved too big for us at the time, and we only released one episode. But the episode was really good, and that's why we're bringing it back on this podcast. The topic is safe spaces, trigger warnings, and microaggressions. Of course, these topics can be sensitive, so if now is not the right time for you to listen to this podcast, we encourage you to check out another one of our episodes, like last week's interview with Arnie Duncan. Let's get on to the episode. Here is UC3P Presents What If?
What if I told you a little bit about what you are about to listen to? What if this show is about public policy? What if this show is about ideas? And what if this show is about questioning your assumptions and shaping the public discourse? This show may be all of that and more, and we hope you come away with two things: a perspective you have heard for the first time, and a thirst for engaging with the people around you. We encourage you to think, talk, act, react, and engage. That is our goal, and we can only accomplish it with your help. Enough meta. You're listening to our inaugural episode, Safe Spaces, Trigger Warnings, and Microaggressions. Each of these phrases is highly contested, and I will not give you dictionary definitions. Instead, you will hear over a dozen perspectives on what they mean, why they are important, and how they should influence the public policies we pursue on university campuses and beyond. This includes numerous student voices, a debate between members of UC3P, an interview with Professor Kubota of the Psychology Department at the University of Chicago, and a think piece by yours truly. I should mention that we interviewed over a dozen students on the University of Chicago's main quadrangle, of which 9 have been chosen for this episode. They are all anonymous and will show up throughout the piece. By the end of it all, you will have listened to an hour and a half of divergent voices, hopefully reflecting the greatest diversity we could find. We are so proud to bring you this episode, and we hope you enjoy it. My name is David Raban, and you're listening to What If? First up, UC3P member and law school student Beth Karp interviews Professor Geoffrey R. Stone, the Edward H. Levy Distinguished Service Professor at the University of Chicago Law School. Here's the interview.
All right.
So, Professor Stone, thank you very much for doing this.
My pleasure.
We are interested in exploring a little bit what's happening with safe spaces and trigger warnings on campus. Obviously, it's a hot topic at the university as well as nationwide. Then we're also interested in speaking to you about some of the broader issues entailed. So my first question for you is simply how you define safe spaces and trigger warnings and whether you believe it aligns with the university's definition, or the university administration, rather.
Well, I think trigger warnings refer to situations in which typically a faculty member will inform a student or students generally that materials to be read or discussed in the class might be particularly upsetting to individuals. And my own view about trigger warnings is that they rest entirely within the domain of academic freedom of the faculty member, and that individual faculty members may feel comfortable doing that and others may not. And it's not a matter about which there's any university policy, nor should there be.
And what about safe spaces?
Nobody knows what safe spaces means, frankly. What I would understand it to mean, and unlike trigger warnings, I don't think there's any definition you can look up about this, but what I would understand it to mean is that it is important for people, students and others, to have an opportunity to speak with others with whom they identify for any particular reason, in which they can explore ideas in a context in which it feels comfortable, and where they can pursue their own inquiries and arguments within a group. And I think the university is filled with that kind of safe space. There's endless organizations, student organizations, for literally any possible group one could imagine, in which if they wish to have meetings in private among themselves, they're completely free to do so. And I think that's important, and I think that's a valuable thing for any group. It doesn't matter what it is. And I think that's uncontroversial.
So I think there's a general agreement that the kind of spaces that you're speaking about, affinity groups, et cetera, have a place on campus. But I wonder about the letter that was sent out where the university administration, Dean of Students Ellison, wrote that the university does not support so-called trigger warnings, et cetera. Do you think that does not support means do not endorse or are against?
I don't agree with that letter. I don't think it reflected the university's policy or views. I think it was a mistake that was made by a dean of students in the college.
I want to ask if you have ever made any judgment calls related to free speech or safe spaces or trigger warnings in your experience as dean of the law school or as provost of the university.
The issue has never arisen in any of my official capacities. To the extent faculty members have used warnings in various ways, it's always been in their discretion. I've never had a situation as a professor in which I felt the need to give a trigger warning. The situation in which I would clearly do it is if I learned from a student or from the dean of students that there was a student in a class I was teaching who had had some sort of traumatic experience, and that it would be painful for me to call on that student to talk about that subject. And if I knew that, I would have no qualms at all about not calling on the student on that occasion. But law is a little different because for the most part, students know what they're going to be encountering just by the syllabus. I suppose if you're teaching literature, where the name of the book may not indicate what happens in every scene, there may be circumstances where students are surprised by something they encounter, and where it may therefore be more logical to think about, this novel may have some material in it that may seriously upset some students, and to indicate that. But I think that's entirely a matter within the discretion of individual faculty members.
So I can actually think of an example from the law school classroom last term where in my criminal class we were talking about rape. And the cases in certain instances were rather graphic and I'm sure for some students upsetting. And the way that the professor framed the lesson was that he was having some students speak for the plaintiff and some some students speaking for the opinion and some people speaking for the dissent. And in a couple of cases, the dissent was, a very old-fashioned sort of notion that there's a difficulty drawing a line between rape and, quote, aggressive seduction. And that was a class in which I wondered about whether a trigger warning would have been appropriate in that case, because students were actually being asked to argue for a position.
Well, that's not a trigger warning situation. Students knew they were reading material about rape. You're talking about a faculty member doing something in class that doesn't call on certain students, I assume. And I would say there, if a student feels uncomfortable about being called on, they should let the faculty member know. This is a law school. Students are being trained to be lawyers. And they need to be able to both hear things they don't like and argue about things that make them uncomfortable and represent clients, and including going to a faculty member and saying, it's important to me not to be called on here. And I would think that professor would have respected that.
Yeah, I respect that. Thank you for your answer. So I wanted to ask you about a couple examples of controversial campus speech. And the first two relate to this university with two poster incidents. The October's divestment posters, in which divestment was associated with terrorism. And then I believe it was in December that we had some posters put up by a neo-Nazi group. And in both cases, those posters were posted by outside groups, which I think gave the administration an easy decision about how to approach that kind of speech. But I also wonder if the response would have been the same if a student group had posted that kind of thing.
I don't know enough about the facts of either case to have any opinion. If students posted posters in what was within the bounds of where and when and how posters can be posted, I don't think the university should intervene because the posters might be upsetting to other students, at least outside residence halls. Residence halls, I think, are a little different, and certainly inside classrooms are different. But in public spaces, I don't think the university should be deciding which posters are permitted and which are not. Non-students don't have any right to post posters, so that's a different issue. And if the university has policies by which you have to seek permission to put up a poster because you don't want posters posted all over each other, as long as that's done without regard to the message, I think that's fine.
I also wanted to ask about an example of speech that comes from Yale, which got a lot of attention in the past couple of years, where there was a fraternity group who went out into a section of campus where many freshman women live, chanting, no means yes, and yes means anal. And the university in that case, I believe, told the fraternity that they had to disband or that they were banned from campus. So I think that entails maybe a number of questions. The one that I'm particularly interested in is at what point a university decides to intervene.
In my view, universities should intervene in public discourse on campus only in situations where the speech is legal, or where it's a threat, or it's harassment, or where it's defamation, or it's invasion of privacy, or where the speech so directly interferes with the core functions of the university. But in this instance, I would have thought the appropriate response was to call these students assholes.
Okay, so to your mind, that would constitute harassment?
No.
No.
That's not the definition of harassment.
Okay. So when you say call these students assholes, do you mean that, what does that mean for an administration?
It means other students should have said what they thought.
Okay, so you believe that the correct response was for the response to come from the student body?
Yeah.
That actually leads right into my next question. You've written that the only way colleges and universities can prepare their students to be effective citizens of the real world is not by shielding them from such ugliness, but by empowering them to respond to such speech with courage, dignity, and reason. So my question for you is that, in the law school, we're at an age where I think we are reasonably empowered to speak for ourselves. But when you're looking at young students coming right out of high school, how does a university empower students to respond in that fashion?
Well, the first thing that's interesting is I know students don't like to talk about this, but there seems to be a general sense, which doesn't surprise me from knowing parents and kids wholly outside the university, that this generation of young students, or some members of it at least, have been raised in ways that are pretty different from their predecessors. They've been protected from frustration, from defeat, from not being number one and winning the trophy. And I think they come to college a little bit less prepared than students 5, 10, 20 years ago, which I think is a problem. I think it's not very good parenting in my view. But